Victoria has a 59-metre waterfall most people have never heard of. A World War II grain shed on Australia's National Heritage List that made the same list as the Sydney Opera House. A Welsh-speaking gold town that went from 20,000 people to 62. I know that sounds like a list someone made up. It's not. There are 15 of these places, verified, documented, sitting a short drive off main highways, and almost no one outside the regions where they exist could name a single one. Here's the thing about Victoria's hidden places. They're not hidden because they're hard to reach. Several of them are right off a highway. Some are 10 minutes from a main road. They're hidden because Australian tourism infrastructure, the official itineraries, the highway signs, the curated travel guides, tends to funnel everyone toward the same handful of postcard locations. Locals have known about these spots for decades. The data backs them up. Verified historical records, national heritage listings, world geological records. These aren't rumours. They're documented facts that somehow never made it into the mainstream conversation. And there are 15 of them. Start with something that sounds almost too simple. A waterhole. A gorge. Some trees. That's essentially what Blue Pool is. And yet, ask anyone in Briagalong where locals go on a warm afternoon, and they'll point you here without hesitation. This is a deep, natural waterhole carved into a narrow basalt gorge in the Briagalong State Forest, sitting just a few minutes' walk from a small forest car park that most GPS systems don't even bother to flag. There are no entrance fees, no rangers handing out maps at a booth, no gift shop. What there is, dark water dropping into a basalt slot, mountain ash canopy overhead, and a stillness that doesn't feel like it should exist this close to civilization. The reason this place stayed off the mainstream map is almost bureaucratic in its logic. Blue Pool sits within the Briagalong State Forest, a state forest, not a national park. In Australian tourism culture, that distinction matters more than it should. National parks get the infrastructure budget, the interpretive signs, the Instagram campaigns. State forests get a gravel car park and a fire risk rating. The Peregrine Lookout Trail runs through the same forest network, offering high country views that would anchor a tourism campaign in any other context, and it too remains almost entirely unknown outside the region. The whole area was developed as a state forest recreation asset, which is exactly why it never got the promotional machinery that national parks receive. The water temperature is the detail that surprises people most. You'd expect a deep, shaded basalt gorge to run cold year-round, cold enough to make swimming feel like a punishment. Blue Pool doesn't behave that way. The water stays at a temperature that locals describe as consistently swimmable through multiple seasons, a function of the gorge's geology and the particular way it traps and holds heat. That's not something you'll read in a brochure, because there isn't one. You learn it from someone who's been coming here since they were a kid. The broader Briagalong area sits in East Gippsland, which itself is one of the most ecologically diverse regions in southeastern Australia, and one of the most under-visited relative to its size. The forest surrounding Blue Pool contains old-growth mountain ash at the lower altitudes, and transitions into alpine ash further up the ranges, a landscape gradient that very few visitors ever move through in a single day. Driving in from the highway, you pass paddocks and farmland, then the forest closes around the road with almost no warning. The transition from cleared agricultural land to dense canopy happens in under a kilometre. The honest caveat here, Briagalong is not close to everything. The nearest major hospital is in Sale, and if the weather closes in, which it can, fast in the ranges, the road out can get complicated. There's also limited phone coverage once you're properly into the forest. That's not a reason to skip it. It is a reason to go prepared, which most people who visit here already know. They've learned because someone local told them. That's been the access mechanism for Blue Pool since it was first cleared as a recreation site. Word of mouth, passed between people who actually live here. And for a long time, that kept it exactly as good as it is. What you get at the end of that walk is one of those rare places in Victoria where you feel like you've stumbled onto something. Not because it's been manufactured to feel that way, no amphitheatre seating, no carefully positioned viewing platform, but because it hasn't been touched in any way that removes that sensation. The basalt walls drop into the water at angles that catch light differently depending on the time of day. Early morning puts the gorge in full shade, the water almost black. Late afternoon, the sun hits the western wall and the whole pool shifts colour. That specific light, at that specific time, is something you can only see if you're actually there. Which is maybe the point. Victoria's highest single-drop waterfall is 59 metres tall. I know that sounds like the kind of claim someone makes about their local creek after a big rain. It's not. Agnes Falls, tucked into a tight granite gorge in South Gippsland, drops 59 metres in a single, unbroken cascade, taller than most office buildings you've walked past without looking up. And the majority of Victorians have never heard of it. The falls are only a short drive off the South Gippsland Highway, the main artery that connects Melbourne to Leongatha, Foster and Fish Creek. Hundreds of thousands of cars travel that route every year, holiday makers heading to Wilson's Promontory, weekend drivers looking for cheese and wine in the hills. Almost none of them turn off for Agnes Falls. The signage is there, the road is sealed for most of the distance. The walk from the car park to the viewing platform is short. There is no logistical reason why this place remains as quiet as it does. The name has a story worth knowing. The falls were named for Agnes Louisa, the daughter of early grazier John Gellion, who settled the surrounding land in the colonial era. The Agnes River, which feeds the falls, was officially gazetted under that name in 1866, making this one of the older formally recorded geographical features in the Gippsland region. The naming of rivers and watercourses after family members was common practice in the mid to late 19th century, a way of staking a kind of permanent territorial claim that land titles alone couldn't provide. Agnes Louisa's name is now attached to a 59-metre geological feature. Most people who pass within 5 kilometres of it have no idea she existed. The gorge itself is granite, unusual for this part of South Gippsland, which is dominated by softer sedimentary country. The granite intrusion creates the tight, vertical walls that give the falls their character. Standing at the viewing platform, the sound arrives before the visual, a low, consistent roar that fills the gorge and bounces off walls close enough to touch on either side. After heavy rain, the volume of water increases dramatically and the spray carries well beyond the platform. In dry conditions, the falls narrow but don't disappear. The Agnes River maintains enough flow year-round to keep the drop visible in all seasons. The isolation of Agnes Falls within South Gippsland's tourism landscape is one of those puzzles that gets harder to explain the more you think about it. This is a region actively promoted for its farms, its coastline, its proximity to Wilson's Promontory National Park. Tourism infrastructure is not the problem. South Gippsland has accommodation, cafes, well-maintained roads. The falls simply never found their way into the dominant narrative of the region. No single dramatic event, no particular moment of rediscovery. Just a 59-metre waterfall sitting quietly in a granite gorge, a short drive off a highway, waiting for people who know to look. The drawback worth acknowledging: the viewing area, while accessible, doesn't allow safe descent to the base of the falls, and the surrounding terrain gets slippery after rain. The gorge walls are steep, and the rock is wet in all but the driest months. Some visitors arrive expecting a swimming hole at the base and find a fence and a platform instead. That frustration is understandable, but it doesn't change what the falls actually are. The longest single-drop waterfall in the state, in a gorge that feels remote despite being close to a sealed highway. Agnes Louisa got a pretty good memorial, all things considered. You've just seen 2 places in Victoria with world-class credentials. 59 metres of falling water, a basalt gorge that stays swimmable year-round, that most Victorians couldn't locate on a map. But the next place isn't just a natural feature. It's a piece of engineered timber that was supposed to last a decade, and is still standing after more than a century. And the reason it's still standing says something about what Victoria built in eras that have been largely forgotten. There's a moment when you come around a bend in the forest near Newgee, and the trees part just enough to show you a curved timber bridge rising 21 metres out of the mountain ash. Nothing prepares you for the scale. It's 100 metres long, made entirely of timber, and it bends, actually curves, as it crosses the valley. This is the tallest surviving timber trestle bridge in Victoria. It sits an hour from any sizable town, up a narrow valley road that requires a little commitment to navigate. And it was never supposed to still be here. The bridge was built in 1919 as part of the Newgee Warrigal Timber Line. a railway built to haul logs and farm produce out of the high country forest and down to the Gippsland Plains. The line served the timber industry at a time when mountain ash from these ranges was supplying construction timber across Victoria. The trestle bridge was the engineering solution to crossing a valley where a conventional embankment was impractical, a temporary solution built from the same timber the railway was designed to carry. It was not designed with permanence in mind. The engineering expectation was something in the range of a decade or two of useful life. The line closed in 1958 when road transport made the railway economically unviable. By that point, the bridge had already outlived its projected lifespan by a significant margin. In 1971, the National Trust classified it, an act of heritage recognition that saved it from the alternative fate of most redundant railway infrastructure, which is demolition or simply being left to collapse. The classification meant active maintenance. It meant the structure continued to be monitored, repaired and preserved, rather than allowed to slowly return to the forest floor. What makes the Newgee Trestle Bridge unusual as a heritage site is the material. Timber trestle bridges were built across Victoria and New South Wales during the railway expansion of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Most of them are gone, replaced with concrete and steel, or dismantled after line closures. The Newgee Bridge survived because the valley it crosses is not on the way to anywhere else. There was no commercial reason to demolish it, and the National Trust classification provided the cultural reason to preserve it. Isolation, in this case, was a form of protection. The mountain ash forest surrounding the bridge is one of the tallest forest types in the world. At maturity, mountain ash can reach 90 metres, taller than the bridge is long. Walking through it on the approach track gives the bridge visit a specific character. You move through a canopy that dwarfs everything, and then you arrive at a human structure that somehow holds its own against the scale. That contrast, engineered timber against old-growth forest, is the visual experience of Newgee, and it can't be approximated by a photograph. The town of Newgee itself is small and quiet, a former timber town that lost its economic engine when the mills closed. The valley road that leads to the bridge passes through farmland before the forest takes over, and the whole drive from the Warrigal side has a particular quality of remoteness that increases gradually rather than arriving all at once. The honest limitation: the bridge is not illuminated, has no interpretive signage worth mentioning, and the surrounding road network can be challenging in wet weather. Go in good conditions, with a vehicle that can handle unsealed sections. The bridge will be exactly as described when you get there. The town of Dargo has 99 people. 99. And a pub that has been running since 1898. That ratio, one pub for every 99 people in a valley ringed by alpine wilderness, tells you most of what you need to know about the character of this place. Dargo is not a town that evolved into a gateway community for adventure tourists. It's a frontier outpost that has been functioning as exactly that since the high country around it was first settled, and it has never found a reason to change. The Dargo Hotel, established in 1898, is the social and logistical centre of the community. It serves four-wheel drive drivers preparing to head up the Dargo High Plains, deer hunters using the valley as a staging point, trout anglers working the Dargo River and its tributaries, and the small permanent population of the surrounding valleys. The pub is not a boutique heritage experience with reclaimed timber bar stools and a curated craft beer list. It is a functioning country pub that happens to have been functioning for well over a century, in a location where the alternative to driving back to Bairnsdale for supplies is doing without. The valley floor around Dargo is lined with groves of walnut trees planted over a century ago. This is not a detail that shows up in most descriptions of the area, which tend to focus on the alpine country above the town. But driving into Dargo along the Dargo River Road in autumn, those walnut groves create a canopy of yellow that is visually specific to this valley, in a way that feels entirely out of place in the Australian high country. They were planted by early settlers and have simply kept growing, now enormous, shading the valley floor in a way that makes the drive in feel like arriving somewhere that has been quietly tended for a very long time. Beyond Dargo, the track to Wanangata Station runs into country that is remote by any standard. Wanangata was once Victoria's most isolated cattle station, reachable only by serious four-wheel drive routes that cross creek beds, climb ridges, and drop into valleys where phone coverage doesn't exist. Dargo is the last place with fuel, food, and a phone before that country begins. That position, last outpost before wilderness, gives the town a functional importance that keeps it alive in a way that pure tourism economics probably wouldn't. The high country above Dargo includes some of the most significant alpine ash and snow gum country in Victoria, running up into the Alpine National Park. In summer, the Dargo High Plains Road opens to the plains above, where the vegetation flattens out into open snowgrass and the views extend across ranges in every direction. In winter, that road closes and the valley contracts around the small community left below. 99 people. A pub from 1898. Century-old walnut trees dropping leaves onto a river road in autumn. There's a life being lived here that most Victorians have never thought to look at. The honest challenge of Dargo. It is remote. The drive from Bairnsdale takes well over an hour on roads that are sealed to a point and then become gravel, and in wet weather the river road can be difficult. Medical services are hours away. Fuel, when the pub is closed, is not guaranteed. These are not inconveniences to be waved away. They're the actual conditions of life in a community this isolated. But they're also the reason the place is the way it is. The isolation is not incidental to the character of Dargo. It is the character of Dargo. Most drivers on the western highway between Horsham and Dimboola pass it without stopping. Some notice a pink tinge near the road and assume it's a trick of the light. It's not. Loch Eel, known locally as Pink Lake, can turn a vivid, almost artificial-looking rose colour after rain, and the mechanism behind that colour is weirder than most people expect from a roadside lake in the Victorian Mallee. The pink coloration comes from halophilic bacteria living in the salt crust, microorganisms, including species such as Salinobacter ruber, that produce a red-pink pigment as a byproduct of their metabolic processes. The bacteria thrive in highly saline conditions that would kill most other life. The colour varies with season, rainfall, and salt concentration, which means the lake can look pale pink, deep magenta, almost white, or completely ordinary depending on exactly when you're passing. The timing of observation determines what you see. Most people who drive past see an ordinary-looking shallow lake and keep going. Commercial salt extraction from this lake dates back to the 1860s, when early European settlers recognised the salt deposits as an accessible economic resource in a region that had few. The industry fluctuated over the following century and a half, and extraction eventually ceased before being formally resumed in 2009 through an agreement between the Victorian Government, the Barangi-Gajin Land Council, and Mount Zero Olives. That three-party arrangement, state government, traditional owner land council, and a private producer, is an uncommon management model for a natural feature, and it reflects the cultural significance of the area to the Wotjobaluk people, alongside its commercial value. The Mallee landscape around the lake is flat, wide, and dominated by Mallee eucalyptus scrub, a low, multi-stemmed eucalyptus that grows from a lignituber and regenerates after fire from the root system rather than from seed. It's not conventionally dramatic country. There are no peaks on the horizon, no dramatic geological formations. The sky is the feature. On a clear day near Dimboola, the sky is enormous, in a way that feels almost aggressive, horizon to horizon, uninterrupted, with the flat scrublands running underneath it in every direction. Against that backdrop, a lake that turns pink becomes disorienting. The scale of the landscape makes the colour feel even more improbable. The drawback at Pink Lake is entirely practical. The colour is not guaranteed. You can drive out specifically to see a pink lake and find a perfectly ordinary-looking body of pale water. The bacteria respond to conditions that change seasonally and are affected by rainfall amounts and timing. Locals in Dimboola can often tell you whether conditions have been right recently, which is the most reliable way to time a visit. The lake also has no formal viewing infrastructure, no platform, no signage explaining the biology. You pull over on the side of the highway and look, which, given that the explanation is stranger than most people would expect from a roadside stop, makes a little signage feel like it might be warranted. Everything so far has been geology, timber, frontier pubs, and bacteria. But the next town hid something during World War II that changed the course of the Pacific Air War, and kept it secret from its own residents while it was happening. The base handled aircraft that had survived attacks at Broome and Darwin in 1942. A Mallee village of under 1,000 people became Australia's classified repair depot for flying boats, and most Australians still don't know. Lake Boga has 985 residents and a lake that looks like it was designed for water skiing competitions, which it occasionally hosts. That is the public face of the town. The other face is a World War II military installation that was classified, kept secret from the local community during the war, and today houses a restored Catalina flying boat in a purpose-built hangar beside the same lake it once used as a runway. On April 1st, 1942, and the date is not a coincidence in its historical irony, the No. 1 flying boat repair depot was requisitioned at Lake Boga. By June 28th of that year, the first RAAF personnel had arrived. By July 12th, the first Catalina flying boat had been delivered. The speed of the establishment reflects the urgency. Japanese air raids had destroyed flying boats at Broome on March 3 and at Darwin shortly before, eliminating Australia's primary coastal patrol and transport aircraft at the exact moment they were most needed. The RAAF needed a repair facility that was inland, away from the coastal threat, on a body of water large enough for flying boats to land and take off. Lake Boga, in the Victorian Mallee, fit every criterion. The base was deliberately concealed from the local population. Residents of Lake Boga knew something was happening on the lake. The personnel movements, the construction activity, the aircraft arriving. But the specifics were withheld as a matter of wartime security. The base operated until 1947, repairing and returning to service the Catalinas that were patrolling Australia's northern coastline, conducting search and rescue operations, and transporting personnel across the Pacific Theatre. The contribution of this small Mallee lake to the Allied air effort in the Pacific is measurable. The recognition it has received is not proportional to that contribution. Today, the Flying Boat Museum at Lake Boga holds a restored Catalina, one of the aircraft types that was serviced at this exact location during the war. The hangar sits beside the lake, and the visual combination of a World War II flying boat in a contemporary museum building next to a recreational lake in regional Victoria creates a cognitive dissonance that takes a moment to resolve. This is not a Metropolitan War Memorial. This is the actual location. The lake outside the window is the lake those aircraft landed on. That specific geographical continuity gives the museum a quality that replica exhibits in city institutions can't replicate. The broader Lake Boga Township is a relaxed, functional Mallee community, a service hub for surrounding agricultural land with a pub, a caravan park, and the kind of amenities that make it a viable weekend destination rather than just a drive-through. The lake itself is used for water sports year-round, which adds a strange temporal layering to the place. Families water skiing on the same stretch of water where Catalinas were landing in 1942, a few hundred metres from a hangar holding the aircraft that used it. Most visitors to the water sports don't visit the museum. Most visitors to the museum don't stay to watch the water sports. The two stories about this lake coexist without quite meeting. The limitation most visitors encounter is the museum's operating hours, which are not continuous. It's worth checking current opening times before making a dedicated trip from Swan Hill or Mildura. The town itself has enough to occupy a half day, but if the museum is the primary draw and it's closed, the visit deflates quickly. That said, the lake is freely accessible regardless, and the car park beside the water gives you the geographical context, even without the hangar open. Standing at the lake's edge, looking at the flat expanse of water in every direction, the choice of this location makes immediate physical sense. It's not hard to see why the RAAF found it in 1942. It's harder to understand why the rest of the country forgot. In 1941, someone in the Australian government made the decision to build a temporary grain storage facility in Matoa, using approximately 600 unmilled timber poles as the structural framework, on the understanding that it would probably stand for about a decade before needing replacement. In 2014, that same structure was added to Australia's National Heritage List as the 101st listed national icon. It is a World War II wartime grain shed. It made the same list as the Sydney Opera House and the Great Barrier Reef. The Stick Shed, its formal designation is Grain Store No. 1, was built between 1941 and 1942 as an emergency bulk wheat storage facility during the war. The Japanese threat to coastal shipping created a logistics crisis for Australian grain exports, and inland storage became critical. The poles used in construction were sourced from local timber and left unmilled, round, rough, still bearing the taper of the original trees. When the interior is lit up, the effect is cathedral-like, hundreds of tapering poles rising to a curved roof, the space enormous, and the light filtering through in a way that has no agricultural precedent and every architectural one. The shed is roughly the length of 6 Olympic swimming pools and wide enough that the far end disappears into shadow from the entrance. The scale is not apparent from the outside, where the corrugated iron cladding and low roofline give no indication of what's inside. The interior reveals itself as you enter, and the acoustic quality of the space is as notable as the visual. Sound moves differently inside a structure of 600 timber poles. The ambient noise of the shed, the way a voice carries or doesn't, the particular resonance of footsteps on concrete, these are details that photographs don't capture and visitors consistently comment on. The heritage listing in 2014 came after a sustained advocacy campaign by local historical groups and the Matoa community. The 101st listing on the National Heritage List was not a spontaneous government recognition. It was the result of people who understood what this building was, making the argument to people who didn't. The argument they made was about the intersection of agricultural history, wartime engineering, and vernacular architecture. This is a structure that documents how Australia responded to a specific crisis in a specific way, using locally available materials in a form that was functional first and everything else incidentally. Matoa itself is a Wimmera grain town with a population that reflects the mechanisation of agriculture over the past half-century. Smaller than its mid-20th century peak, centred on a main street that has the particular character of regional Victoria towns, where the buildings were built for a larger population than currently occupies them. The silos beside the shed are still used. The agricultural context of the stick shed is not historical. The landscape around it is still producing the grain it was built to store, just with different logistics now. The shed is the anachronism. The wheat is continuous. The honest note. Matoa is not on a major tourist route. Getting there requires a deliberate detour from the Western Highway or the Wimmera Highway, and the surrounding town offers limited accommodation options. The stick shed itself has guided tours available on specific days, and the experience is significantly richer with a guide than without one. The construction details and wartime context are not self-explanatory from the interior alone, but the structure is open to view regardless, and the interior can be experienced by any visitor during operating hours. It was the 101st thing Australia decided was worth protecting forever. That decision was correct. The scale is the first thing wrong. Walking down Tarnagulla's main street, you pass banks that are twice as tall as they need to be for a town of 133 people. Churches with facades sized for congregations that haven't existed in over a century. An 1861 theatre hotel, whose dimensions belong to a city precinct, not a village. The built environment of Tarnagulla is a document of an economy that peaked, spent lavishly, and then collapsed, leaving the architecture behind to stand in a landscape it no longer fits. The reason for that architecture is the poverty reef. The name sounds like an ironic joke until you look at the numbers. Between 1854 and 1856, more than 13.5 tonnes of gold were recovered from a section of the poverty reef, only about 3 metres wide and 120 metres deep. Read that again if you need to. 3 metres wide, 120 metres deep. 13.5 tonnes of gold. From that specific slot of quartz in the ground in 2 years. It was one of the richest quartz reefs ever mined in Australian history, and the town that formed above it spent the wealth on buildings that were meant to signal permanence. The Theatre Hotel, built in 1861, is the most striking of those buildings. It was constructed when the population of Tarnagulla was high enough to fill a theatre, and when the town's commercial and social confidence was running at its peak. Within decades, the reef was worked out, the population collapsed, and the Theatre Hotel was left in a town that no longer had the numbers to sustain it. Today it still stands on the main street, the most oversized building in a streetscape full of oversized buildings, all of them quietly narrating the trajectory of a community that went from extraordinary wealth to 133 people in the span of a human lifetime. What makes Tarnagulla worth visiting, rather than just reading about, is that the streetscape is remarkably intact. Gold rush towns in Victoria often survive in fragments, a preserved bank here, a heritage-listed church there, surrounded by infill development that obscures the original character. Tarnagulla never had enough post-gold development to disrupt its Victorian-era layout. The town's decline began before the 20th century, introduced the architectural styles that transformed most Australian main streets. What remains is almost exactly what was built during and immediately after the gold peak, a main street of the 1860s and 1870s, occupied by a population of 133, with no commercial reason to demolish or replace any of it. The Poverty Reef itself is still visible, accessible via walking tracks on the edge of town. The landscape around the diggings has the particular character of heavily worked gold country. Uneven ground, old mullock heaps, vegetation that grows differently over disturbed soil. The reef outcrop is identifiable as quartz at the surface, the same material that produced the gold below. Standing at the reef and looking back at the town that it built, the connection between geological accident and human ambition is unusually legible. Tarnagulla sits between Bendigo and Dunolly, accessible on sealed roads that carry light traffic. The town has limited services, no cafe with consistent hours, no accommodation beyond what you'd bring yourself. It rewards visitors who treat it as a destination in its own right, rather than a detour from somewhere else, and who bring enough time to walk the main streets slowly, look at the buildings with attention, and consider what they were built for. The scale of the buildings is not an accident. It was a statement of confidence. The confidence turned out to be premature. 13.5 tons of gold from a 3-metre wide reef. That's what just built a theatre in a town of 133 people. But the next place on this list didn't find gold in a reef. It found the single largest alluvial gold nugget in human history, 3 centimetres below the surface of a dirt road, 72 kilograms, found by 2 men with a metal detector equivalent of the 1860s, and the town that marks the spot has 80 people. On the morning of February 5, 1869, 2 men named John Deason and Richard Oates were working a paddock near a place called Molliagull when their equipment registered something 3 centimetres below the surface. 3 centimetres. The depth of a finger pressed into soft ground. What they lifted out was a mass of gold and quartz that weighed approximately 72 kilograms. The welcome stranger. The largest alluvial gold nugget ever found anywhere on Earth. The town of Molliagull today has 80 permanent residents. The discovery almost defies the logic of gold mining as an industry. The entire premise of reef mining, the technology, the capital investment, the shafts and machinery, rests on the assumption that gold is deep in the ground, difficult to access, requiring substantial effort to reach. The welcome stranger was 3 centimetres down. It was essentially sitting on the surface, covered by a layer of soil so thin that it had probably been walked over thousands of times before Deason and Oates found it. The nugget was so large that it had to be broken into 3 pieces to fit on the scales available at the time, which were the only means of accurately weighing it. The granite obelisk marking the exact discovery site was dedicated on November 19, 1897, 28 years after the find, by which time the gold rush had receded and most of the population that had flooded into central Victoria was already gone. The obelisk is specific about the location. It marks the paddock where the nugget was found, not a nearby hill or a general area, but the specific ground. That precision matters in a way that's hard to articulate. Standing at the obelisk in Molliagull, you are standing at the exact location where the largest alluvial gold nugget in history came out of the ground. The paddock looks like every other paddock in central Victoria. Molliagull as a place today is close to the threshold below which a community stops functioning as a town. 80 people is enough to sustain a few essential services, a hall, a sense of communal identity. It is not enough to support commercial tourism infrastructure. No cafe, no visitor centre, no accommodation. The road through Molliagull is minor enough that through traffic is negligible. The visitors who come are gold history enthusiasts, people working through a systematic exploration of Victorian goldfields history, researchers. They know what they're coming for, and they find it without difficulty. The obelisk is on the roadside. You can see it from the car. The broader landscape around Molliagull is open central Victorian farmland, rolling, cleared country with scattered eucalypts, the remains of old diggings visible as subtle undulations in paddocks that have been grazed for a century and a half since the rush. The absence of drama in the landscape around the obelisk is part of what makes the visit disorienting. There is no gorge, no mountain, no geological feature that explains why this specific spot produced what it did. The Welcome Stranger was a geological accident of the most complete kind, an enormous mass of alluvial gold deposited by water action over thousands of years, covered by 3 centimetres of soil in a paddock in Victoria. The gold itself no longer exists as an object. The nugget was melted down almost immediately after its discovery. The Bank of New South Wales bought it at Dunolly, and it was smelted into bullion. The weight in gold of the Welcome Stranger, 72 kilograms, is verifiable through the historical record. The physical nugget is not. What remains at Meleagle is the obelisk, the paddock, and 80 people living in a township that once attracted thousands. The contrast between those numbers, 72 kilograms, 80 residents, is the whole story of the central Victorian goldfields in a single location. Every account of the Victorian gold rush starts somewhere. Every newspaper story, every history textbook, every documentary. The starting point is usually the year, 1851, and the general location, central Victoria. What they often leave out is the specific town. The Victorian gold rush began at Clunes, not in a general sense, not approximately. James Esmond registered the first gold discovery in the colony at Clunes in 1851, and the report in the Geelong Advertiser triggered the rush that would permanently alter Victoria's population, economy, and political structure. The town that started all of that has 1,700 residents today. The population at Clunes peaked at around 6,000 during the gold years, a figure that represents the extraordinary concentration of people into Victorian goldfield towns in the early 1850s. The descent from 6,000 to 1,700 happened over many decades and reflects the general trajectory of goldfield communities once the easily accessible gold was gone. First the diggers left, then the service industries that supported them contracted, then the population stabilised at whatever level the surrounding agricultural economy could sustain. Clunes stabilised at a number large enough to keep most civic institutions functional. The main street still has the bones of a gold-era town. What's specific about Clunes in the historical record is the mechanism of the rush itself. Esmond's discovery was reported in the Geelong Advertiser in July 1851, and the newspaper report is the transmission vector through which the news spread through the colony. Within weeks, people were moving toward the goldfields. Within months, Victoria's demographic profile was transforming in ways that had not been anticipated or planned for. The colonial government in Melbourne was dealing with the social and economic consequences of a discovery that had been communicated through a single newspaper article. The chain of causation, one man, one discovery, one newspaper, one colony transformed, runs through Clunes. The town today hosts an annual book fair that draws visitors from across Victoria and beyond, one of regional Australia's more distinctive community events, running on the strength of the town's heritage character and the particular combination of historic buildings and market atmosphere. It's a different kind of tourism draw than gold history, and it has given Clunes a second identity alongside its historical one. The main street that hosts the fair is the same street whose character was established during the gold rush, the buildings dating from the period when 6,000 people were living in or around the town. The irony embedded in Clunes's present situation is that the town which triggered the entire Victorian gold rush, the discovery that brought hundreds of thousands of people to Victoria and permanently changed who Australians were and where they came from, barely features in mainstream Victorian tourism. Ballarat and Bendigo, which grew larger on the wealth the rush generated, received the historical attribution and the tourist infrastructure. Clunes, where it started, gets a paragraph in the footnotes. That discrepancy is not new. It's been the condition of the town for most of the past century and a half. Clunes sits on the Midland Highway between Ballarat and Maryborough, in country that transitions between volcanic plains and lighter central Victorian farmland. It's an easy drive from Ballarat, close enough for a half-day trip from that city, which itself draws visitors specifically for its goldfields history. Most of those visitors have no idea that the rush that made Ballarat what it is began at a town 40 minutes up the road. That gap in the narrative is not hard to fill in if you know to look. But the looking has to be deliberate. Clunes doesn't announce itself. After Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana in August 2005, the storm surge and flooding destroyed formations along the Mississippi River Delta that had been, until that point, the longest naturally formed silt jetties on Earth. The destruction of those formations left a gap in the geological record. The gap was filled by a set of formations in Victoria that most Australians had never heard of. The Mitchell River silt jetties near Eagle Point are now the longest naturally formed silt jetties on Earth, extending roughly 8 kilometres into Lake King in a digitate delta pattern. Victoria holds that record. The jetties were formed over thousands of years by flood sediment carried by the Mitchell River into Lake King, one of the Gippsland Lakes system. As the river slows on entering the lake, it deposits its sediment load in finger-like projections that extend into the still water, a formation type called a digitate delta. The Mitchell River's particular combination of sediment load, flow rate, and the geometry of Lake King produced jetties of exceptional length. They grew incrementally over a geological timescale, each flood event adding material, the projections extending further into the lake, season by season, over millennia. The visual effect of the silt jetties, viewed from the elevated lookout at Eagle Point, is one of the stranger landscapes in Victoria. The lake is blue-grey, the jetties are narrow brown lines extending into it, tree-lined along their length, tapering as they go further from the shore. They look almost engineered, too linear, too organised, too deliberately structured to be natural. That's the dissonance that the lookout produces. You're looking at something natural that your brain keeps trying to categorise as built. The trees growing along the jetty margins are a mix of swamp paperbark and other wetland species, giving the formations a vegetated profile that makes them more visible from height. The Gippsland Lake system, of which Lake King is a part, is itself one of the largest coastal lake systems in Australia, a vast network of shallow lagoons, channels and wetlands behind the 90-mile beach barrier dune system. The Mitchell River jetties sit within this broader system, but their geological uniqueness has a specificity that the general Gippsland Lakes description doesn't capture. The jetties are a product of a specific river's behaviour over a specific geological period, depositing sediment in a specific pattern. They are, in that sense, a one-of-a-kind product of very particular conditions. Eagle Point is a small township on the western shore of Lake King, south of Bairnsdale. The lookout providing the best view of the silt jetties is accessible from the town and is a short walk from a car park. The walk itself is not demanding, the elevation change is modest and the track is maintained. What's interesting about the Eagle Point lookout is that it sits in a quiet residential tourist community that has no particular infrastructure investment in the world record formation it overlooks. There's a car park, there's a track, there's a view. The longest naturally formed silt jetties on Earth are visible from a modest community lookout in a town most Victorians would need to locate on a map. The limitation here is the dependency on good visibility for the full experience. Lake King, in flat, clear conditions, allows you to trace the jetties out to their tips several kilometres into the water. In poor visibility, morning fog, afternoon haze, overcast conditions, the distinction between jetty and open water diminishes. A sunny morning on a calm day is the optimal visit condition, and East Gippsland provides those conditions regularly enough to make the timing manageable. But it's worth knowing that the visual impact varies significantly with conditions. The geological record is fixed. What you actually see from the lookout is weather dependent. Most Australians, if asked to name Australia's largest inland island, would guess somewhere in the Northern Territory, maybe Queensland. Somewhere vast and tropical, with the kind of scale that the top end or the Gulf country suggests. The correct answer is Victoria. Gunbower Island, wedged between the Murray River and Gunbower Creek in northern Victoria's Mallee Country, is Australia's largest inland island. That is a geographical record that the state holds and almost no one knows about. The island is bounded on its northern edge by the Murray River, the same river that forms Victoria's border with New South Wales, and on its southern edge by Gunbower Creek, which meanders through red gum forest parallel to the main river. The land between those two watercourses, the island itself, is a maze of billabongs, floodplain woodland, lignum swamps, and river red gum stands of extraordinary size. The red gums here are old, some of the largest individuals in the Murray-Darling Basin, with trunk diameters that require multiple people to encircle, and canopies that spread over a significant area of floodplain. The forest was listed as a Ramsar wetland in 1982, a designation under the International Ramsar Convention that recognises wetlands of global ecological significance. The National Park proclamation came in 2010, giving the forest formal protected area status alongside the existing Ramsar recognition. Together, those designations reflect the ecological value of a floodplain forest system that is increasingly rare along the heavily modified Murray-Darling system. Many of the wetlands and red gum forests that once characterised the Victorian Murray have been drained, cleared, or altered by water regulation. Gunbower represents a significant fragment of what the floodplain once looked like. The platypus is the wildlife detail that consistently surprises visitors. Gunbower's Creek and Billabong system supports a platypus population that is visible to patient observers in the early morning and evening. The combination of platypus with the broader red gum forest environment, giant trees, maze-like waterways, the sound of water moving through vegetation, generates the kind of encounter with Australian nature that tourists pay considerable amounts to access in marketed destinations. At Gunbower, it's accessible to anyone willing to drive to Kahuna or Leachville and explore from there. The Kakadu of the South description attached to Gunbower is a promotional comparison that does some justice to the landscape character without being entirely accurate. The ecological systems are different. Gunbower is temperate floodplain forest, not tropical monsoon savanna. The scale is different, the wildlife is different, but the quality of the comparison is real. This is a large, ecologically significant, publicly accessible wetland landscape that is dramatically undervisited relative to its ecological significance. The comparison to Kakadu is a measure of ambition about what Gunbower could be in the public imagination. Whether that ambition is warranted is a question the landscape answers for itself. The practical limitation at Gunbower is that navigation within the forest requires some preparation. The Creek and Billabong network is maze-like, and without a track map or local knowledge, it's easy to spend a morning going in circles on dirt tracks that all look similar. The forest also floods during high Murray River events, which can make sections of the internal road network inaccessible. Checking conditions before visiting is essential, but Kahuna, the nearest township, is a functional regional centre with services, and the infrastructure base for a Gunbower visit is more solid than for some of the more remote places on this list. Australia's largest inland island deserves to be on more itineraries than it currently occupies. Nothing on this list so far has quite prepared you for Llanelli. We've talked about oversized buildings in a town of 133 people. We've talked about 80 people living near the find site of the world's largest gold nugget. But Llanelli is a locality of 62 people. 62 that once had a population of approximately 20,000. That is not a typo. I know it sounds like one. It's not. At the peak of the gold rush at Hard Hills in the late 1850s, historical accounts describe a community of up to 20,000 people in the area around what would be named Llanelli. Today, 62 people live there, and for decades during the gold period, the dominant language spoken in the streets was Welsh. Not English, Welsh. The Welsh connection is the element that makes Llanelli something strange in the story of Victorian settlement. Welsh miners, arriving via the general movement of people that the gold rush produced, settled at Hard Hills in sufficient numbers to establish a community where their language and culture were dominant. The town was named Llanelli, the spelling is Welsh, referencing the town of Llanelli in Wales, by these miners around 1860. The linguistic community they created was not a linguistic minority in an English-speaking town. Welsh was the working language, the social language, the language of commerce and community in a Victorian goldfield settlement of thousands. The town went through a brief renaming between 1872 and 1882, when it was called Maidentown, an anglicisation of uncertain origin, before reverting to Llanelli. That decade of English naming sits as a parenthesis in a history that is fundamentally Welsh in its character and self-identification. The Welsh miners who named the town in 1860 were making a claim about what kind of community this was. The reversion to Llanelli in 1882 reasserted that claim. The gold had largely run out by then, but the cultural identity of the place persisted, even as the population that had created it dispersed. The cemetery is the most legible surviving document of what Llanelli was. Walking through it, the Welsh surnames on the headstones accumulate into a portrait of a community. Jones, Davies, Williams, Evans, Thomas, Hughes. the same surnames that fill churchyards in Carmarthenshire and Gwynedd, transposed to a cleared paddock in central Victoria in the 1860s and 1870s. Many of the inscriptions were originally in Welsh as well as English, the dual language memorial as an assertion of cultural continuity by people who were building a community in a landscape utterly unlike the one they came from. The ruins of Llanelli's Gold-era built environment are fragmentary: stone foundations, the outlines of structures in disturbed ground, the particular vegetation patterns that grow differently over filled wells and old floors. Unlike Tarnagulla, which preserved its main streets substantially intact, Llanelli's built fabric did not survive the depopulation. The community at its peak of 20,000 was primarily a tent and timber settlement, as most goldfield communities at their height were, and that construction type doesn't persist. What Gold Rush Llanelli looked like at its peak, 20,000 people, Welsh-speaking, a town in every functional sense, exists only in the historical record. The 62 current residents of Llanelli live in a locality that carries its extraordinary history largely without infrastructure to explain it. There's no interpretive centre, no heritage walk with explanatory signs, no organised tourism presence. The cemetery is accessible and maintained. The rest requires a combination of local knowledge and historical research to understand what you're looking at. That absence of explanation is both the characteristic limitation and, in a different sense, a measure of how far the community fell. When a place drops from 20,000 to 62, the infrastructure of explanation disappears, along with the people who might have provided it. Llanelli is a ghost town that didn't fully ghost. 62 people remain, in a place that once held a Welsh-speaking city. Licola has 11 people. Not 1,100, 11. It is, by every functional definition, a tiny settlement in the upper McAllister River Valley, surrounded by the Alpine National Park on multiple sides, not connected to the state electricity grid, and not accessible to the general public for overnight stays in the way that most communities this remote theoretically are. What makes Licola categorically different from every other settlement on this list, and from almost every other settlement in Victoria, is the reason it exists in its current form. Licola is the only privately owned town in the state of Victoria. The Lions Clubs of Victoria and southern New South Wales own the freehold title to the entire township. The history of how that came to be involves a former timber mill community in a river valley that was becoming economically unviable as the timber industry contracted. In the late 1960s, the Lions Clubs, the international service organisation, acquired the village, recognising it as a potential site for the kind of wilderness programme that takes disadvantaged urban children into remote alpine environments for structured outdoor experiences. The Lions Clubs of Victoria and southern New South Wales hold the freehold. The Licola Wilderness Village has been operating since the early 1970s, providing camps and programs that have served tens of thousands of young people over more than 5 decades. The off-grid status of Licola is not a romantic affectation. It is a practical consequence of geography. The Licola Valley sits far enough from the state electricity grid and in terrain complex enough that grid connection has never been economically justified. The settlement generates its own power from hydroelectric and generator sources, manages its own water supply from the river system, and operates with a self-sufficiency that most Victorians have never needed to think about. The 11 permanent residents, staff and management of the Wilderness Village live with infrastructure realities that are different from anywhere else in the state. The Alpine National Park surrounds Licola on multiple sides, and the McAllister River runs through the valley with a clarity and volume that reflect the quality of the alpine catchment above. The valley itself is narrow and steep-sided, heavily forested, the kind of mountain country that the children who come to Licola for camps cannot have experienced in Melbourne or Geelong. That environmental contrast, the density of the city versus the silence of an alpine river valley, is the operational premise of the Wilderness Village. The programme works because the landscape works. Access to Licola is via a road that runs up the McAllister River Valley from Hayfield, a long, winding route through state forest that is sealed for most of its length but requires attention in wet conditions. The town itself is not open to casual visitors for overnight accommodation, except through the Licola Wilderness Village programme or limited campground access. This is not a community that has tourism as an objective, it exists for its charitable purpose. The 11 permanent residents are there to run that purpose, not to host travellers. The attraction of Licola for anyone researching Victorian places is conceptual rather than experiential. It is the only town in Victoria that a charity owns outright, that generates its own power, and that was deliberately acquired to serve children who needed somewhere extraordinary to go. The Lions Club's ownership of Licola is the kind of institutional detail that sounds like a clerical error until you start looking at the documentation. A private title, a charitable owner, a town not on the electricity grid, an alpine valley with 11 residents, and a purpose that has served the community for over 50 years. This is what a town looks like when its primary function is not commerce or agriculture or industry, but transformation. The transformation of young people through encounter with an alpine environment that has no equivalent in their daily lives. The 11 people who live there permanently are the custodians of that function. The town continues because the function continues. None of the places on this list quite match what Walhalla represents, not in scale, not in drama, not in the sheer improbability of what happened here and what remains. Start with this. Cohen's Reef, running beneath the valley at Walhalla, produced more than 55 tons of gold. 55 tons from a single reef, in a single valley, in a town that today has 20 permanent residents. Victoria's largest single gold reef ran under a settlement so geometrically constrained by its topography that the buildings were literally tunnelled and terraced into the valley walls because there was no flat ground to build on. Walhalla was founded in 1862 when Edward Stringer discovered gold in the Stringers Creek Valley, a steep, narrow cleft in the Baw Baw Ranges, about 100 kilometres east of Melbourne. The geology of the valley is the physical fact that defines everything about the town's character. Stringers Creek runs along a valley floor so narrow and so flanked by steep forested walls that the conventional horizontal logic of town planning simply did not apply. Buildings went up the walls, roads were cut into slopes, infrastructure was suspended, propped, cantilevered. The settlement that emerged was unlike any other goldfield town in Victoria, a vertical community in a horizontal country. At its peak in the 1880s, Walhalla supported a population of around 4,000 people. That population density, in a valley of those dimensions, produced a town of extraordinary intensity. The Long Tunnel Extended Mine, the primary producer on Cohen's Reef, was operating on a near-continuous basis, the gold ore being processed through stamper batteries that ran day and night. The sound of the batteries, the smell of the processing chemicals, the steam from the engines. These were the permanent sensory background of a community living in one of Victoria's most spectacular and inaccessible mountain valleys. The 4,000 people of Walhalla inhabited a place that required sustained engineering effort just to keep supplied with the basic necessities of life. The decline began after 1900 as the accessible ore grades dropped and the cost of extraction increased. The decline was not sudden, it extended over several decades, the population contracting gradually as households and businesses found the economics of staying in Walhalla no longer viable. The infrastructure began to fail. The railway that had been built to connect Walhalla to the outside world, itself a feat of mountain engineering, eventually closed. The last of the major mining operations wound down. By the mid-20th century, Walhalla was approaching the functional definition of a ghost town, a built environment largely without the population that had built it. What saved Walhalla from complete abandonment was the same feature that created its extreme character in the first place, the valley. The topography that made Walhalla impractical as a modern community made it irreplaceable as a heritage site. The buildings tunnelled into the valley walls didn't have anywhere to go. The cemetery on the hillside above the town, terraced into the slope in multiple levels because even the dead needed to be stored vertically, is one of the most visually specific heritage sites in Victoria. The graves are cut into the hill. The view from the upper terraces looks down over the entire valley, the creek, the surviving buildings, the ranges rising on every side. Today, 20 permanent residents live in Walhalla. 20. Where 4,000 once operated a mining and processing complex that produced 55 tons of gold from a single reef system. The surviving buildings, hotels, miners' cottages, the general store, the cricket ground cut impossibly into the slope, are maintained by heritage organisations and the small permanent community. The Walhalla Goldfields Railway, a narrow-gauge tourist railway that runs along Stringers Creek between Walhalla and Thompson Station, operates on weekends and provides an unusual approach to the valley, arriving by narrow-gauge steam train in a mountain valley unchanged in its basic topography since the 1880s, is not an experience available anywhere else in Victoria. The Long Tunnel Extended Mine Tour takes visitors underground into the actual reef workings. The tunnels driven through the rock to access Cohen's Reef are still there, still shaped the way the miners left them, still showing the structural logic of the extraction that produced 55 tons of gold. The mine guide can point to the reef itself, the actual quartz formation from which the gold came. Standing underground in a tunnel driven in the 1880s, looking at the rock that made this valley briefly the most productive gold mining location in Victoria, the 55-ton figure ceases to be abstract. The reef is real. The tunnel is real. The 20 people living above it are the current chapter in a story that started in 1862 and has not yet concluded. The character of Walhalla in 2026 is that of a place in active recovery from near extinction. The tourism infrastructure, the railway, the mine tour, the accommodation options, the cricket ground that hosts occasional matches, represents a deliberate effort by the people invested in the place to pull it back from the edge of becoming purely a ruin. That effort is partially succeeding. Weekend visitor numbers have been growing. The heritage buildings are in better condition than they were 20 years ago. The valley has found a post-gold identity that is built around what the gold left behind, rather than around the gold itself. But 20 people is still 20 people. The school closed long ago. Medical services are in Moe or Warrigal. The road in, a sealed route through the Baw Baw foothills, is manageable but narrow in places, and the valley sits in country that gets significant rainfall and occasional snow in winter. The isolation is not incidental to the Walhalla experience, just as it was not incidental to the Walhalla community at its peak. The valley's topography imposed conditions on everyone who lived here. 4,000 people at the boom, 20 people now. The valley doesn't change. The number of people willing to accept its terms does. Cohen's Reef produced more gold from this one valley than most Australian goldfields produced from entire regions. 55 tonnes is a quantity of gold that, at current prices, represents a figure difficult to contextualise in any domestic frame of reference. It came out of a creek valley in the Baw Baw Ranges through the effort of thousands of people who built a vertical town in a landscape that didn't accommodate horizontal thinking. What they left behind, the terraced cemetery, the tunnelled buildings, the mine workings, the narrow-gauge railway, is one of the most complete documents of industrial and community history in Victoria. And 20 people live there now, maintaining the document that 4,000 people created. 15 places. None of them on the standard tourism itinerary. All of them documented. Every one of them sitting a few hours from someone reading this who has never heard of it. The question isn't whether these places are worth finding. It's whether the way we talk about Victoria leaves any room for them at all. Which of these 15 would you actually go to first? Drop it below. If this format is how you want to explore regional Australia, subscribe. There's a lot